former candidate for the U.S. Senate, longtime radio talk show host, author, and conservative policy advocate.
Justices to the Supreme Court, the left has been in open panic.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
After the virus, will America experience depression or rebirth? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. We're devoting today's show not to the past, what might have been, what was done right and wrong, because we can't change that, and not to the present, because we're all bombarded every day with a blizzard of information, facts, and figures about infection rates, death rates, and, of course, unprecedented restrictions on our lives, which become more disturbing by the day in so many ways. Now, we're going to talk about the future, what America will look like when we wake up from this national nightmare, what changes we can expect, and we all know there will be many. How we as a people will have changed based on the change happening in each of us individually during this time. Re-examine priorities. More time with family, like it or not. Kids home from school all the time, finding a way to live with zero sports or bars or restaurants or movie theaters. Reconsidering the merits of working online instead of commuting. Now, just like when we're in the middle of an actual nightmare, we can't know if we're now at 2 a.m. with hours before we wake, or 7 a.m. close to rising, or who knows what time before we finally snap out of it. But snap out of it we will one of these days, a changed nation in a changed world, just like after 9/11. So in that spirit, we'll bring on a trio of big guns from LibertyNation.com today, Editor-in-Chief Leesa K. Donner, on how American society and culture is likely to look when the corona dust clears. Managing Editor Mark Angelides on the biggest changes likely to occur across the world after the virus. And Legal Affairs Editor Scott Cosenza on the gains and losses for liberty and the likely state of liberty itself when the crisis passes. So we're now far enough along in this strange new COVID world to at least start imagining what things might look like when this once unimaginable disruption of our lives and health and economy comes to a merciful conclusion. Could be weeks, months, perhaps longer. We may or may not be close to having a vaccine or reliable treatment, but one way or the other, we best prepare for an unprecedented and awkward re-entry into a world we once knew, but like after 9/11, will find profoundly changed. Yes, we remember the first world and the ever more distant memories of the normal times pre-COVID, and we're now in a second world gripped in the heart of the crisis itself. But how will things shake out in the third world we anticipate when the crisis subsides, when we feel safe returning to our now altered lives? In coping with a crisis far from the realm of possibility in the minds of everyone from President Trump to the homeless man on the street, we've been challenged to squeeze every last ounce of restraint and patience and compassion out of ourselves, but also to find new pathways, new talents, new habits. Add up the changes which are occurring to and in each of us, and America writ large will undoubtedly be a changed society when the smoke clears and the fog of war is replaced with that most blessed of commodities, normal life. Now, we know that familial relationships will either be strengthened or weakened by overexposure during this time, but that's hard to quantify given tens of millions of individual families. For society as a whole, however, some consequential or even wholesale changes are foreseeable in many areas of life. Let's talk about 5 of them. The first, internet preeminence. One thing seems certain: the internet will be more predominant than ever. Because so much of our economy is based or supported online, the work of so many people can now be accomplished in an infinite number of locations, as it has by necessity in these last weeks. There exist in the U.S. alone more than 1 million internet-based businesses, and that's just the official count. Thus, the internet has actually saved the country from the virtual return to the Stone Age this episode would have signaled as recently as 25 years ago, when today's internet was little more than a dream you would think about in the same terms as the old Jetsons TV show. Those who have rechanneled their work to home or elsewhere will evaluate the experience and likely ponder afresh the associated joys and trials of it. Of course, many will be forced to rethink their very careers. Businesses will similarly evaluate externally based productivity during this unique time and adjust accordingly. The striking contrast during this time between the seamless continuity of online operations like LibertyNation.com and the wrenching displacement of those who rely on the offline world will hardly be lost on the many purveyors of commerce gasping for air at this time. How about China? Here's the two words for that: never again. Given what Trump calls the Chinese virus and our dependency for medical and pharmaceutical relief from the very source of the virus, it's now become fashionable and predictable for even longtime China apologists like Joe Biden to jump on the anti-China bandwagon. As Trump demonstrated in his hardball negotiations for a new trade deal, not to mention his constant chiding of China for years before his presidential run, we should have long ago been outraged over growing American dependency on China and Chinese infiltration into American life and commerce. Rest assured that big changes will be fast-tracked after the virus. How about the state of education? The universal transfer of virtually all educational operations to online portals during this crisis represents a forced radical experiment in the limits of online education, which could well result in a spike in the online presence of academic institutions. Considering that the cost of secondary education is rising even faster than that of health care, and thus is unattainable for so many people, the ability of colleges or even high schools to reduce their overhead and shrink out-of-control tuitions, together with students' ability to learn without having to go to a classroom, is a plus-sum outcome which could signal a sea change in how we educate rising generations in this 21st century. Then there's the border wall. With every nation in the world desirous of closing its borders to prevent the spread of this virus, how hard do you think Democrats will now be willing to fight Trump on building his big, beautiful wall on our southern border? More than 150 miles of it have already been built, construction likely to pick up significantly when the coast is clear. And then there's sports. How essential are sports to society? It's been said that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And considering the collective withdrawal symptoms evident in fans of every sport across the globe, the paradise which is competitive sports does indeed look like a parking lot these days. It seems clear that each of us individually will reconsider by necessity just how important this most popular form of entertainment truly is to us. And it will certainly be reflected in the growing or dwindling popularity of the various sports. And here's the last thing I want to talk about: humility. In the end, pride goeth before the fall, and lest we get too full of ourselves, some hard and bitter perspective for you. All of mankind has just been thwarted by a virus from a bat. Think about that. A virus from a bat. If that doesn't make you and all of mankind more humble, nothing will. And we'll be back to discuss the changes to American society and culture after the virus when we return.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, we all know how profound the changes are likely to be in American society when we finally return to something approaching normal. Some are big, some small, some in between, but a keen observer and prolific writer about cultural and societal trends in this unique era of social distancing and a total absence of public gatherings is the editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com, Leesa K. Donner. who joins us now. Hello, Leesa.
Hi, Tim. How are you in this strange and unusual environment we're living in now?
Well, you and I are figuring ways to navigate it, and we're very blessed in this time, more than many, more than most, I suppose. But
well, let's face it, we're not minding it too much.
No, I mean, we enjoy home life. I mean, we spend a lot of time and money trying to get our home just right, so we like being at home. But what's the first thing you want to throw out in terms of what's bound to change when the dust settles and the smoke clears from this long national nightmare, as Gerald Ford once called Watergate, which was far less important than this?
Well, we certainly all will value bathroom tissue a little bit more, won't we?
I think that's a given, and we'll think more carefully about its dispensation and how much we actually need to use each time we enter the bathroom. But you've got some broader ideas about how society will change.
Okay, seriously. I think Americans have always respected personal space. You know, there's like that zone that you go into that, you know, when you're a little too close to somebody. I think that personal space zone is going to widen a little bit more. I think people will be a little more cognizant of that. I think there really is going to be some cultural changes. For instance, gratuitous shaking of hands in church when they do the sign of peace. They call it the sign of peace. I think that's going to go the way of the dodo bird.
Do you think as a society overreact for a period of days, weeks, months, years to all of this? Will it forever be sort of imprinted on us so that we'll always, you think, going forward, pretty much be reticent of shaking hands?
Well, I think it's a possibility. You know, it's not necessary. I don't think people are going to stop hugging and kissing the people that they love. But I think just, you know, when you meet somebody, it's not necessary really to shake hands. But one really good thing, Tim, that I wanted to mention is that I think Americans who previously were on the fence regarding the Second Amendment may now swing towards supporting it. And I think that's because a record number of first-time buyers have gone to the store to get themselves a firearm. So there could be an attitude shift here.
Well, what about public gatherings, though? Because there's likely to be an attitude shift on that as well. I mean, you'd think on the one hand, because we've been starved of all public gatherings and all private gatherings of really more than about 10 people, and most people aren't even doing that anymore. We've been starved of that, and we've been starved of entertainment and plays and, of course, sports. Do you think the appetite for that, at first, there's probably be an insatiable appetite once it comes back. But do you think in the long run that the need or desire for all these public gatherings is going to be greater or lesser than it is now?
I don't see anybody giving up their Eagles tickets or their Washington Capitals tickets, season tickets anytime soon.
Now, as you look at how big a cultural shift there's likely to be, do you see it as closer to, you know, a 5% cultural shift? Or closer to like a 50% or even greater cultural shift in terms of the overall difference in the culture when this is over compared to what it was before this whole crisis took hold?
Well, I think it depends how long it goes on. And Graham Noble brought up in an article on libertynation.com today that the coronavirus isn't simply just going to go away. It's going to return like a seasonal virus. So I think, you know, the longer that kind of thing is out there, the more people are going to want to alter their behavior because they just don't want to get sick.
Now, I'd love to have you comment on the last item that I mentioned in the first segment of the show about the changes that I see coming in American society. And the last one that I pointed out was humility, not just for Americans, but for people across the world. when you sit and stop and realize that all of mankind has been brought low by a virus from a bat. A virus from a bat. Can we ever not be more humble after going through that?
You know, I'm not sure there's going to be a lot of character changes. I think that if you have a propensity to being a humble person, you're going to be humble. But if you prone the other way, I don't see a lot of character changes.
Okay, Leesa, how about the border wall? Now, nations all over the world are closing their borders. Do you think that Donald Trump is going to meet the kind of resistance after this is over that he did before in trying to close off the border, make it more secure, build the wall?
Well, thus far, I don't think Mexico and the Southern Hemisphere has been hit quite the same way, but they will be. And I think there's a good chance that when they are, people are going to think twice about the entire immigration system. I really do. Again, it's sort of like the Second Amendment. Those people that are on the fence, you know, somewhere down the middle, don't really have a big opinion. They're not going to be so hep on people, you know, jumping under and over and whatever barrier that we have.
Security will become a predominant issue, no question, in whatever world develops after the coronavirus finally goes away. Leesa, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tim.
Leesa K. Dunner, editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com. Quick break, then we'll be back to talk about what changes after the virus we're likely to see across the world.
Where can you find honest political commentary? With sobering analysis.
Even the most trusting among us may find a company's latest plans deeply intrusive.
Accountability.
Perhaps it's time to start asking the right questions.
Deconstructing threats to our liberty.
Unparalleled insight into important stuff.
And boldly reporting the truth.
Truth is making a comeback.
Well, hello again, and welcome to Election 2020 Roundtable.
Uprising podcast of LibertyNation.com.
Abortion is functionally sexist.
From my cold, dead hand.
Subscribe to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel, where facts matter.
Click on youtube.com/LibertyNation.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
One of the distinguishing characteristics of the coronavirus is that no nation, no person has been spared from its deadly spread. Every nation of the world has been affected, some more than others, but changes are coming across the globe when this virus has finally been conquered. And here to discuss what the biggest changes are likely to be is LibertyNation.com managing editor and international correspondent Mark Angelides, joining us from the UK. Hello, Mark. Welcome back.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me on again.
Well, it's a pleasure as always. Of the changes you expect to take hold in the years ahead after this virus passes, one of the most significant will be to the European Union, yes?
Yes, very much so. We can see from what's happening right now, it's not so much in a state of flux, but more in a state of decline. It's the whole principle of the European Union, that it's nations operating together, has just disappeared out the window. It's completely gone. You have nations fining other nations. You have nations stealing personal protective equipment from other nations. This whole idea that they can work cooperatively together and ignore all national interest, it's just been proven a complete lie. And I really don't think that, other than a trading bloc, I don't think the EU will survive much longer.
Now, another big element in this, though, Mark, in the apparent, although perhaps slow, demise of the European Union is the open borders between the 20-plus countries of the EU, which has been a major problem during this coronavirus because individual countries have limited control over their own borders because EU is by itself, by definition, an open borders union.
What's happened is that countries have tried to impose limits on who can enter the country, because obviously if there's a major disaster in one country in terms of the pandemic, what you're going to find is that people are trying to get away from that. As you do, you run away from disaster. If it's going to prove fatal, you get out the way. And by doing that, they've been traveling over borders. Now, actually, I think we're seeing something similar coming out of New York in America, with there's so many cases of COVID-19 in New York. People are leaving, and you've got to be wondering, are they taking the disease with them? And this is very much what happened in Europe with the open borders. People have just been flooding into areas where they believe there's less of the virus. And consequently, of course, what we've seen is that there's an uptick in virus cases in these countries because they can't close the borders.
Does the spread of and response to COVID-19 likely, in your view, signal an expansion or contraction of what we call globalism, global economy, one world order?
Tim, I think you know my answer to that already. It's really very much going to be globalism in the future going forward, on this premise that we're talking about the world ahead after COVID-19. It's going to be viewed with a great deal more skepticism than it has been. I mean, the idea of globalism, as H.G. Wells wrote more than 100 years ago, that the idea of a one world government appears wherever there are men of intelligence. But it was a pipe dream back then. It's a pipe dream now. And the reason is that when times are good, it's fantastic to be magnanimous. It's fantastic to be generous and talk about cooperation. But when the lean times come, you have to choose who to look after first. And the easiest, the best in many ways, form to look after first is the nation state, because you share, in many instances, you share a currency, you share a language, you have the same laws, therefore that's your country. And that country has to look after itself first. And so what we're going to see going forward, in my opinion, is that the idea of globalism, this international cooperation where we can cede sovereignty to other organizations and to other, in fact, to other countries, it's going to be more frowned upon because it prevents nations acting in their own best interest and looking after their people as best as they possibly could. We saw this uproar from the media and from Joe Biden, of course, when Donald Trump closed the borders to China.
Yes.
We know this now, that even the most rabid anti-Trumpers are admitting that if he hadn't, then it could have been 95% more cases. And this is the reality of the situation. Globalism is great in fat times, and it's terrible in lean times.
Now, it's important to point out, too, that as Donald Trump promotes what he calls, and others rightly call, an America First policy, he has at the same time encouraged other nations to do the same thing. In other words, he's told the Italians, you need to do Italy first, the French, France first, England, the UK first, that these are the policies that are successful ultimately, not just for the U.S., but for every country around the globe, simply looking after their own interests. But let me move to the ideological prism into which this whole crisis and pandemic is being put. right versus left, because everything comes down to that ultimately, and this is being treated by the American media and by the American left as nothing more than another in a long line of Trump scandals. But the right and the left are positioning to advantage themselves through this crisis. Which side's going to come out on top?
In reality, Tim, I think it's very clearly going to be the more right-leaning side, because it's these right-leaning things, well, the things that have been identified as right-leaning, especially in modern times, that are doing the most effective work to combat COVID-19. For example, if I may, the idea of closing borders. We've heard for many years from the left that, you know, the idea of having closed borders to people is not just poor for the economy, they say, but it's inherently racist, and it's a bad thing. And the only people who support closing borders are racist people, are terrible people. But we're finding that that's not actually the case. We're finding that closing borders is a necessity in certain times, and it's something that people should be able to do. Also, being able to monitor exactly how many people are coming into your country, being able to check their passports, being able to actually look them in the face, the people who are coming in, and see, are they sick? Are these people actually ill? I mean, we should, of course, help them, but should we be allowing them to come straight through and go into any small town where they can infect old people, young people? No, we need to know who the people are, and we need to know what state they're in.
Now, last question is regarding China, and everybody knows here in the U.S. that things are going to change with China. Our dependence on them for pharmaceutical and medical relief, the degree to which they've stolen intellectual property. We've had one-sided trade deals with big tariffs on one end and very, very low on the other. But what about the rest of the world? How will the relationship between China and the EU and China and other areas of the world be likely to change after this?
Well, there's certainly going to be a larger amount of distrust of the Chinese government, not just because of, this is where the virus came from. I mean, this could happen in any country, a virus coming out. But of course, this was a preventable virus. If people hadn't been using wet markets that are in filthy conditions and very cruel, and it actually promotes disease. So, I mean, that's the first step. The second step being that China clearly lied about, first, their knowledge of it, and how it was spreading. Secondly, the amount of cases of COVID-19 they had. These numbers are clearly false, and they've been lying about it. And the World Health Organization has been promoting these figures. But there's also something else, the reaction after the COVID had spread around the world. Now, what we've seen is Italy in the early days sent a large amount of personal protective equipment, medical equipment, to China in the form of aid. And now Italy needs it. This same equipment is being sold back to Italy at a profit. And I think that really shows where the interest is here for the Chinese economy. They're very, very keen to make sure that their economy comes out of this stronger than any of the other economies, which are now suffering greatly. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, no more made in China. Let's start buying American. Let's start buying British. Let's start buying Italian from each respective country. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that is going to be a very powerful mover, bringing it back to what Donald Trump said about all nations should be putting themselves first.
Well, a day of reckoning is coming for the Chinese. There's no question. And a great deal of accountability for what they did before, during, and after this virus hit. Mark, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Mark Angelides, managing editor of LibertyNation.com. We'll take a quick break and then come back and examine what the state of our liberty is likely to be when this crisis is gone.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Throughout the program today, we've been examining how America and the world are likely to have changed when this pandemic has finally stopped its deadly spread and we can return to a semblance of normalcy. And the environment for liberty has certainly been at issue as things we never thought could happen here. Incursions into our individual liberty are happening almost faster than we can keep track of them. But that's why we've got LibertyNation.com's Guardian of Individual Liberty to keep us on the cutting edge of the many threats and promising developments for liberty in COVID world, and more importantly, its aftermath. Here he is, constitutional lawyer and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
Well, a lot of threats. A lot of opportunities in COVID world, post-COVID world. What do you see in the way of opportunities or improvement in the environment for liberty once this pandemic is cleared?
Well, I think it's the massive amount of regulations that we have in place, Tim, that do no service to us or humanity or the market or anything else other than protect some narrow interest, which is why they were erected in the first place. And I think we're seeing this all throughout, these various supply chain issues. Like, they've got these situations in many cities where they want to reduce traffic in supermarkets, and they also want to keep alive small businesses. So they've wanted to allow, for instance, restaurants to be able to sell non-prepared food directly to consumers. So they have got a bundle of oranges. They can sell their oranges to they don't have a grocery license, or they don't have this other license or some third license. Well, we know that they're subject to clean food rules. They got a health inspection at the restaurant. What is the reason to keep them from selling directly to consumers? Well, the reason is I'm sure that the grocers don't want that to happen. It's probably the reason why the law was erected in the first place. So it's these kinds of regulations, Tim, that are erected, I think, most often not for any good reason, not for a health benefit. They have maybe some fig leaf of a benefit, but really what they're about is erecting barriers to competitions in the marketplace. And I hope and see that's an opportunity for increased liberty going forward in a post-COVID world. When these things are proposed, more people may stand up and say, what's the reason for this limiting regulation again? And who does it benefit? And what does it cost?
Well, it seems to me, Scott, that things are going to change dramatically for the FDA when this is over, because they're either going to have been lauded because some of the drugs that they didn't allow to come to market were indeed proved to be dangerous. But they could also be brought low by the fact that several of the drugs that they didn't bring to market worked and saved lives, which don't you think ultimately will force the FDA into streamlining their process for the approval of new drugs?
Only, Tim, if the American people force them to do it. They waited, Tim, until April, well into April, to relax the standards of foreign-made masks, N95 masks that hospitals could buy. It's almost like we're not in a crisis at all. It seems like the way that the FDA has been proceeding.
Any more particular opportunities for liberty that you see in the wake of this crisis?
Well, we discussed the sort of federal things, too. There are many state and local regulations that I think would be affected as well. We have the certificate of need for any new healthcare facility can be made in many states. We're both residents of Virginia, and in Virginia, for instance, you cannot, if you and I decided, let's say we won multiple Powerball lotteries and decided to throw up a hospital to benefit our fellow man and woman, we would not be able to do so legally unless we got a special permission slip from the state. Now, I want to make this clear, Tim. This is not something that says that we've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's with respect to cleanliness or following proper procedure. That's not what this is about. This is about the state deciding whether or not the market will be able to handle another hospital. And you might say, well, isn't that up to us or the people who own us? No, it's not. It's up to the state because they've co-opted this decision-making from the market.
Now, the threats to liberty, and there have been many in this crisis, but when the dust settles and the smoke clears, Scott, what new threats to liberty will have strengthened
I think
over the time of this crisis?
I think, Tim, that the biggest threat will come from those who say that it was because of a lack of a centralized response that we have had an aggravation of mortality or other problems, and that more centralization is necessary. And that could either be at the national level. We see plenty of actors now who say that various states are fighting against one another for resources, and that's untenable. And then also at the broader level for world government, to say that, well, if that's true at the national level, why isn't it true at the world level? And I think that it is the enemy of liberty, that centralization, and also probably the enemy of good hygiene and public health. The way that China behaved with their sort of top-down, directive-based society didn't work for getting this information out, and it was less healthy. So I think there's reason for all of us to reject that kind of consequence from this crisis. And really, the people who listen to this kind of show are the ones that have to tell everybody that they know the reasons why individual liberty actually provides for a better outcome. And also you get the benefit of the liberty to boot. It's like the icing on the cake.
Well, we've seen the disconcerting and almost unthinkable specter of the left in all this, which has criticized Donald Trump for being a dictator all along, wanting him to be more of a dictator with more federal power, more federal authority, more federal spending, more federal bills to throw money at the problem. But when you hear the left talk about how Trump has blown this, how he didn't get testing done soon enough, how he didn't cut off travel from Europe soon enough, one thing you never hear from them, which you've heard constantly from President Trump during this crisis, is joining the government with private industry to tackle problems like this. But when you hear the left respond, it's as if only the government is there and private industry has little to no role to play in a crisis like this.
And not only that, but that the actors in private industry need to be brought to bear at the barrel of a gun.
There have been some exceptions like 3M and GM, which had to be sort of induced to step up and kind of do what's called their patriotic duty. But for the most part, what Trump has done, it seems to me, is to employ private industry that specializes in the things that we need in this crisis and let them take the lead as much as possible, while what the left wants, predictably, is more government, more spending, more regulations.
I don't think that having the federal government as a production partner would aid most firms in producing just about anything.
All right. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole with our own Mark Angelides, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue. All of it available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty, and for heaven's sake, stay well. We'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.